what do we know about how this framework for Hormuz could actually work?
Good morning, Lizzie. Well, for starters, we know that it's a breakthrough, a small one between Iran and Oman. Of course, we've reported on this for a month or so, a few weeks at this point, about that deal between the two countries. We've reported earlier, of course, some kind of mechanisms about just how exactly outbound and inbound ships would start making their way through the Strait of Hormuz. But what's important about the framework that was laid out in a joint statement by Oman and Iran yesterday is that, first of all, this is a temporary joint maritime corridor and a project for mine clearance to restore safe navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The two countries are going into further negotiations to discuss how to find a more permanent solution over the next 30 to 60 days. But then the mining or the de-mining process, Lizzie, comes in contradiction with what President Trump had said. Now, something to bear in mind is that President Trump had said that the Strait of Hormuz is clear of mines. He did not provide any evidence to that assertion, and it's definitely a claim that he had done before. But Oman and Iran say that the progress or the process of removing the mines from the Strait of Hormuz is going to be part of this framework, and then finding a more permanent solution will happen. And something that is interesting in this framework, again, according to that joint statement, is that they say that maybe alluding to the fact that Gulf countries may take part or will be included in some way, shape or form in those wider discussions that will take place.
OK, because we did have the encouraging news that the US is preparing to return diplomats to Middle East embassies, those who'd been evacuated before and during the war. So, Abeer, is there any sign of the US or other countries, indeed, in the Middle East buying into this deal here?
Yeah, that New York Times report, Lizzie, suggests, at least for the time being, they, of course, were citing an internal document suggesting that those staff were coming back to the Middle East or thinking about making their way back into the Middle East, suggesting no military escalation from the U.S. side. At least that is our read into it. But then when it comes to the buying in narrative, it's yet to be seen, Lizzie. Of course, this is very, very recent, and it's just important to note here that these negotiations have not included any third parties. They merely took place between Oman and Iran because they border the Strait of Hormuz, and they are the two countries that are meant to see or oversee the return to traffic to the Strait of Hormuz. Now, of course, the entire world has not agreed to the notion of Iran asserting dominance over the Strait of Hormuz. We reported months ago that European countries and some Gulf countries behind closed doors have kind of succumbed to the fact that Iran will oversee or will manage the Strait of Hormuz. But at least publicly facing, they completely disagree with that notion. That is something that Iran and Oman mentioned in the joint statement. By the way, the management of the Strait of Hormuz, a little bit vague, but we will have to see what that means. And of course, whether Gulf countries and the United States will weigh in on what this means. But for the time being, the positive news is causing, as you have mentioned, a 3-day drop in oil prices below $90 on the barrel for now when it comes to Brent.